All right, guys. Today we are going to be looking at how the Americans won the war. How were this ragtag group of continentals able to defeat the largest army and navy in the history of the world up to that point in a war? And we're going to start by looking at the advantages and disadvantages that each side faced going into the war, starting with the side of the Americans. So they had several advantages working in their favor. First of all, they were fighting on home turf. So they knew the land better than the British did, and they were also closer to supplies. So it was much easier for them to get supplies where it needed to be quickly. They also, because they were fighting on their home turf, had plenty of raw materials to work with. Lots of farmland, lots of forests, lots of timber that can be used to help them in defensive situations as they're on the march. Whatever their needs are, there are plenty of raw materials for them to use. They also have several distinct disadvantages. First of all, not all of the colonists wanted to fight the war for independence at the outset. Only about a third of the colonists are actually supporting the fight for independence. They also have no army or navy at the beginning of the war. There's the militiamen, Minutemen, who are willing to fight, but they don't really have a professional trained army. And they have very little cash. The colonies are not full of great wealth. They have lots of raw materials, but they don't have a lot of money. And money can go a long way when you're fighting a war. They also have very little industry. They've been dependent on Great Britain to produce finished products. The colonists, if you remember the mercantile system, the colonists produce the raw materials. They ship it to Great Britain, who uses those raw materials to produce finished goods. When times of war, they can't get those finished goods anymore because they're fighting against the people who do the work, who have the industry. And also, we've had these 13 colonies for a while, and there have been disputes amongst these 13 colonies. The leaders of these 13 colonies have not necessarily cooperated a great deal, so they didn't trust each other. And then the final disadvantage that they had is they have this Congress, which is sort of a governing body, but that governing body doesn't have a ton of authority. The Continental Congress can't make the colonies contribute men or can't make the colonies contribute money, and it can't force the colonies to work together. So even though they had a Congress, it didn't really have a whole bunch of authority to force the colonies to do things. Let's look at the other side. Look at the British. What were their advantages? Well, first of all, was militarily. Britain was the top military in the world. It had the strongest army and it had the strongest navy. Next, the British had lots of money and lots of industry. They could spend their money to produce a whole bunch of finished goods. So building muskets, getting clothing, blankets, food to their soldiers. They could produce that stuff really, really easily. And also, even they're fighting in the colonies, and a third of the colonists are loyalists who supported Great Britain in this struggle. So even though they're not fighting on their home turf, they do have friends in the area who are able to help them. And let's look at some of their disadvantages. It's important to understand that not all people in Britain were on the side of the British necessarily in this struggle. There were many British citizens who supported the colonists' push for self-government. This becomes a much bigger issue as the war winds down. But there are several groups in the British Parliament who are really against this war from the outset, who really don't want to be fighting to hold on to these colonial possessions that, one, aren't really that valuable, and two, they think they have legitimate claims to self-government. The next disadvantage is that Britain is a long way away. It's it's not difficult, but it takes a long time for supplies to get to and from Britain to the battlefield. Also, communication. Anytime orders are given, if they're coming from Britain, it takes a long time for the orders to get there. They also have angered rivals, people like France, who could be persuaded to help the colonists. This also includes the Spanish and the Dutch. I mean, Britain, being the world power at the time, has made plenty of enemies becoming a world power. And so when those world powers have cause to get involved, all right, now Britain isn't just fighting the colonists, then it's fighting the colonists and France and Spain and the Dutch. And the situation gets much more difficult at that point. So how did the Americans, I mean, looking at our advantages and disadvantages, it's obvious that even still, the Continentals, the Americans, had way more disadvantages and way fewer advantages than the British had. So how did the Americans overcome these long odds to defeat the British? Well, what helped the Americans? First of all, as the war wore on, Washington and the American generals improved. Washington started the war with lots of setbacks, but over time, Washington and the other generals get better. They make smarter decisions, and they become the better leaders by the end of the war. Washington was also better at moving his troops quickly. He was able to fight and then quickly retreat. He could move them longer distances much faster. And the ability to move quicker is a really important factor in determining who's going to be successful in a long, drawn-out war. This becomes especially true when you get to Yorktown. The next thing is that the French give assistance to the Americans, to the colonists, at a critical time in the war. I really can't undersell this enough. The French getting involved when they did are a huge help to this cause. And then finally, the Americans used several different tactics that were really successful. In a lot of places, they used guerrilla warfare. They use a style of fighting where they don't necessarily have to fight the British in open battle to inflict casualties, to really hurt the British. So we saw this with General Burgoyne's march down from Canada to Saratoga. This guerrilla warfare that the frontiermen in this area used to harass Burgoyne and his troops on their march south really play a big role in the success of the Continental Army at the Battle of Saratoga, which follows. And we'll see guerrilla warfare plays a huge role also in the Southern Campaign. We see, if you've seen the movie The Patriot, that's an example of the militia in the South using guerrilla warfare against Cornwallis and his army. So that's what helped the Americans. What hurt the British? Well, just like Washington and his generals improved, the exact opposite is true for the British. Their generals didn't really improve. In fact, in some ways, they got worse as the war wore on. Communication problems were a major issue for the British. Not just communication from Great Britain to the generals, but also communication between the generals. And we see this especially at the Battle of Saratoga, where Howe goes one way, Burgoyne goes the other way, and it leads to the defeat of the British at the Battle of Saratoga. The next is the British have a huge army. And supplying a huge army is very difficult, especially when you're not on your home soil. So supplying that army became a big problem for the British, even with their tons of money. And then the fact that just Britain is far away. News and supplies takes 2 months to cross the ocean to get from one side to the other. So imagine news needs to be sent back to Britain. British Parliament has to respond to that and send word back or supplies back, whatever it may need. So it's a 4-month journey back and forth before anything is resolved. And also, the war in Britain was not popular. There were a large group of people who were against the war, as I said. And as the war wears on, it becomes less and less popular. And by the time Cornwallis is forced to surrender at Yorktown, the British Parliament is taken over by a new party, and that party basically says, we're not fighting in the colonies anymore. We're not going to wage an offensive war. We're just going to cede the colonies. We don't need, the 13 colonies in North America aren't significant enough for them to warrant the additional lost army and navy capabilities. They were too worried about losing colonial holdings in the West Indies, in the Caribbean, or in India. Those were much more valuable territories that they wanted to focus on defending. All right. So make sure you answer your response question at the bottom of these notes and print them off before class tomorrow.